Welcome to Nuance with Nikki, the nitty gritty, even if it's shitty. Just a short video on people who don't believe in equality. They don't believe that equality is possible. So I've made the point before and I shall make it again. Most people mistake equality for uniformity. My guy, equality doesn't mean you give everybody the same thing. It means that you don't give everybody a size 3 shoe. Right? The opposite of equality is often uniformity. Okay? So it means treating everybody with the same consideration and the same dignity. It means caring about their equality. And the wisdom is in our national motto, right? Okay? Unity and diversity. So nobody like South Africa aims at this. And I don't think we've got it perfectly, but we are the biggest badasses for trying. Okay, if you go to the Constitutional Court and you look at the back of what the Supreme Court judges, what they sit on, there is this very expensive cow leather that they sit on, and it's kind of black and white. And the one color, I can't remember which, the one color is about how generally we are the same, and the other color is about our individuality. South Africa is aiming for each individual to be accepted for who he is. And of course, like all things that are worth achieving, it's a difficult thing to achieve, you know? And I always believe you should aim for the stars even and be willing to fall on the moon if you need to, okay? Another thing in a constitutional court, what you'll see is it's kind of below ground, and you look at the windows there, right? And all they want to see as they're in court is your shoes, because for the most part, when you see people's shoes, you won't be able to normally tell what race they are. You won't normally be able to tell what sex they are. I mean, of course, if they're wearing high heels. But, from shoes, like, there's very little room to see prejudice while you see the individuality. So those are just some thoughts to think about on this topic of equality. Remember, equality is not uniformity, okay? But I made the point in my last video, and I didn't show receipts, and I love me some receipts. Where is my last video? Come on, Nikki. Come on, please. I made the point in my last video that actually lots of indigenous cultures were incredibly innocent, and they had a deep sense of equality. And you could see that reflected not just in how they treated each other, but in how they treated nature, etc., etc. And by indigenous, I mean indigenous cultures of all continents, including Europe, right? But I just wanted to show you 2 examples from our beautiful continent, Africa, of where there is or has been a deep sense of equality before those who believed in dominance came. This notion that it's unachievable is one of the most harmful notions in the world. Let us speak back against this cuck. Thank you. So, moving swiftly forward, I would recommend that you watch this documentary. I'll put a link in the description as usual, called Krotoa, Koi Child. This is the mother of South Africa, at least modern day South Africa. Of course, South Africa is as old as the Ice Age. She is the mother of Afrikaans. She is an ancestor to many people across many race groups. There are Xhosa people that look up to her as an ancestor, colored people. She's definitely our mother. She had the first interracial relationship in the country. She was the first baptized person in the country. And so I'd like you to get an insight into Griqua culture from a historian. So just give me a moment to find the exact place in the video, and I'll be right back. So Krotoa was our country's first diplomat. She spoke 4 languages. She was a bridge between people, and as a young girl from the age of 10, she had to navigate some very tricky waters that many of us as adults today in a post-rainbowism South Africa struggle with. So she did a phenomenal job. So let's just look more into this, and let's challenge our own lazy notions, shall we?
Violent people, then you never say, well, it's a bit strange that she became an alcoholic. But if you look at the culture at the time, it was a bit strange.
I know from my own experience of child labor, of abuse, of violence meted out, and so on, that the desire to run away is very, very strong.
She then tried to run away.
An important point should be made here. Any culture, irrespective of color, irrespective of whatever, that goes through the same things ends up in the same behavior. Okay? The guy in that original point made in my video, he made a point around black and colored people and alcoholism and drugs as if we hold the monopoly on that, right? I would remind you, so for instance, Ireland, which was the guinea pig for much of the colonization that the British have done since. They were the first people on which this violence was meted out, okay? It's actually become a running joke around them as alcoholics, and I don't think that's fair to say to them, but what I'm trying to say is, irrespective of color, this, that, and the other thing, people are going to act like human beings, okay? So context is important. This is not about making excuses. Please keep following this so that I have a chance to put in all the nuances, okay? I can only put in so many in one video, all right? But please listen to what she's saying.
Several times she was brought back. Was she not beaten when she was brought back? So there's a long history of repeated abuse, and it continues. I mean, there's the emotional abuse. There's the 1657 war when her comrades are kidnapped and she finds herself on the one hand trying to deal with this very patriarchal Dutch culture, but on the other hand just confronting abuse that she just simply hasn't known. The Khoisan did not have jails, the Khoisan did not have prisons, the Khoisan did not practice slavery. And boom, here are all these three things at once.
So let's try that again. The Khoisan, the oldest people in the world since the mother-loving ice age, alive for longer than anybody else.
She hasn't known. The Khoisan did not have jails, the Khoisan did not have prisons, the Khoisan did not practice slavery.
Did not have jails, did not have prisons, did not practice slavery. So for longer than there has been inequality in the world, here in the birthplace of humanity, on the sacred soil of which you have the privilege to live in sunny South Africa, for longer than any place was inhabited, there were no jails, there was no slavery.
And boom, here are all these three things at once. And it has to, in a sense, exist in your conceptual world for you to develop tools to deal with it. But when it doesn't exist, like when the slaves first landed in early 1657, the Khoisan went to ask them, well, why are you so unhappy? Oh, because I'm a slave. Well, why don't you just run away? The notion that you cannot just walk over the next mountain was to them so completely alien. And that...
Absolutely. Absolutely. What an insightful thing for her to say. Please go and watch this documentary, guys. It's complex. I'm going to try and say it. Give me a second to find the words. If I've been a soccer player my whole life, right, and I'm really, really good at soccer, but one day someone comes and they push me into the swimming pool, right, and I can't even swim and I have to learn how to swim. That is similar to what has happened to the colored people and the black people. So the black people having had their land completely removed and the rules of the game changed. Pastoralists, hunters, people who are incredibly self-sufficient for centuries in a land that thrived for centuries. Colored people who are not only the descendants of those people, but also not just the descendants of people who are removed from their land, but the descendants of people who had their land removed from them. Right? They have that double-edged sword, right? And have to acknowledge they're also the descendants of the removers, right? But rejected by their fathers. Reflected in the fact that their contribution to a language they helped build, initiated the building of, in the popular mind it exists that it's not even their language. Repulsive, right? But for centuries, these people were put into a entirely different context, right? And when that guy was saying, that colored, he was speaking about Indian and white people, and there's so much I want to say about their hard work. There's no colored or black South African that has ever denied the work ethic of white and Indian people. Not one of us would ever, you'd never hear us say that. But can we please not divorce that from the fact that this was a perfectly engineered country? Can we not divorce that from the fact that, for instance, white people who came here were vetted. So it's not like all white people in the world are perfect, but before they brought white people here, whether we're talking about the Dutch, whether we're talking about the 1820 settlers, whether we're talking about even the apartheid government, they vetted people for their entrepreneurial skills once gold was discovered. The 1820 settlers, you speak to them, ask them about their family narratives, they'll say, we were gentlefolk, dear. You look back to the Dutch colony, they vetted people. And this is something that I've said before to non-South African white people, and they cringe. They cringe. So I'm going to try and say it gracefully because they can't stand it. But they can get over this, okay? People want to think that South Africa's history or the colonialists were only racist. No, my darling. The foundation of that racism was elitism. Elitism. It existed very deeply in the European mind. I'd recommend studying the Elizabethan chain of being. I have to teach it when I teach Shakespeare, right? Elizabethan chain of being. I say that because I'm Anglo-centric, but essentially it was known as the great chain of being around Europe. And what you're looking at is a notion that you won't find very foreign. It is, how can I say? It is the notion that every single thing in the universe had a perfect order. And you won't find it foreign, but they believe that every person, every being, every stone had a specific place in society, right? So you had God above, you had the angels underneath him. There were 4 categories of angels: powers, principalities, seraphs, and whatever Nikki's brain fart is. Then you had the astrological order, and everything reflected God above and the 4 orders of angels. So God is the head, the 4 orders of angels, right? The sun is the head of the astrological order, and the 4 planets, or the 5 planets that they knew, right? A king is the head, and you see how they have noblemen and commoners? Well, they actually had 4 orders over there. You had give me a second to find a better graph, please. Sorry, guys. I thought I was going to make a short video, but all the stuff I've planned for my next video seems to be flooding out of me. I'm following my intuition. If the universe needed you to hear this message, the universe needed you to hear this message. Time, chance, Beyonce, whatever gods may be. Okay? Whew. So, on the point of Indian and white people being more hardworking, so that's not fair. That's not fair. There is no black or colored person that would deny the tenacity and hard work of those people. But for you to deny the tenacity and hard work of people who wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be in a taxi, of people who are the taxi drivers, and of the Amagwenya auntie who makes fit cooks from 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning, long before the Hardy the black South African woman is up. 3 o'clock in the morning, long before anybody else is up, the taxi drivers are up. And then wakes up the farmer, then wakes up the farmer along with the black working class and the colored working class. I've been there in the morning before the sun rises in that rain in winter. That was a huge part of my childhood. And I've seen hundreds, and there are millions that do this across the country. And only then, around that time, does the farmer wake up, I don't know, between 3 and 4, and then wakes up the middle class across the suburbs in the country of all colors, right? So that is grossly unfair. So I would remind you, for the rest of us, for the majority of us, right, who have all these fancy jobs such as CEO, owner, this, that, and the other thing, who cleans our houses? I don't have somebody cleaning my house. I know a lot of us don't have maids, but in South Africa, it is seen as a right, not a privilege, which is very unusual in this world. Who washes our gardens? Who is the foundation of all these fancy things we're able to do? And is that by accident or design? Did we imagine Bantu education? And we are doing a good job, a better job than we feel we're doing, in spite of everything. Okay, I am not here to pretend that the ANC government has been perfect. Far from it. But I would have you look at the spoil system. But one thing at a time. I was making the point about the Elizabethan chain of being. and European thought at the time that they arrived here in South Africa. I have no idea why I'm showing Robbie vessels. So if you're missing the plot and you didn't see my last video, the one that I'm responding to, I'll read it to you. An unfortunate thing where we find more successful cultures being prejudiced due to that success being misconstrued as starting out in life better than other races. So he denies the very careful engineering of South Africa so that certain people could start out better than others. And I know it's more nuanced than that, okay? But I'm answering his attack. Please give me grace to also say this and have this difficult conversation, okay? These notions are patently false. Nothing is further from the truth, according to him. In today's day and age, there are many nations and peoples and races that started out exactly where black and colored people started out. So that's true, but it's also decontextualized, and that's not fair. Yet they are far more successful in both, such as Indians as a classic example. They keep quite focused on hard work and education, and they are flying. They have a different culture, one that lends itself to a higher standard of living over time. So as I said, we would never deny their success. Please don't put those words in our mouth. However, at this point, I'm going to caveat to speaking about Indian people who once fell under the umbrella of colored. As brown people, we are tired of people using our brownness as an excuse to put blacker people than us down. Okay? Too much over a century. Ask any 60-year-old Indian or colored woman or man how it is felt to have people play Rubik's Cube with our identity. 1 minute we're black, then we're colored, then we're Asian, then we're Okay, please do not weaponize us against other people. I recognize that in this country, there are spaces where black and colored people get along very well, and we're all that we have. We feel like we're all that we have. There are other spaces where Indian and colored people get along and create their little WhatsApp groups and feel like they're all that they have. There are other spaces in this country where white and Indian people have their own WhatsApp group and their own little cliques. There are spaces where white and colored people have their own WhatsApp groups and they have their own cliques. There are even spaces where black and white people have their own cliques, and normally that's the English-speaking world, right? There are spaces where colored and Boere, whatever. It's region-specific, but we create our little cliques and we keep creating our little echo chambers and tell ourselves how we are the victims. Know how I know? I've been in all of those rooms, whether being included or excluded. I've been in all of those spaces across the metropolitan city that is Johannesburg, with my ambiguous racial identity, right? It has afforded me an insight that few get to experience in one lifetime, long before I was 20. Okay, so I have observed these things, and I found that they're just harmful. They're just harmful, right? It's okay to go live in your clique. Go do what you want. There's an oranje. It's working perfectly for itself. It's not hurting any of us. If you are a different race, you can go create a watermelon if you want. You can go create a nachi Go create an orange which pick a fruit. Banana Pick a fruit and go and live there happily. Seriously. Go and live there. Go and live there. You see, there are many of us that are rainbowists, and we believe, Simunye, we are one. But one of the ways this is misconstrued is that we're forcing it on any of you that want to create your cliques, either with your own race or your own preferred partners. I'd like to assure you guys, we're not forcing you. All we're saying is, don't bother us while we get on with that work. Okay? I promise you, we're not a threat to you. A lot of the fears that you have are entirely of your own fabrication. An example of one of these silos and these little people who think that we're a threat to them. Listen.
A certain amount of people which wants to create a nation of unity. And then there's us, the Boers. We don't take part in this, and we're not going to.
So which Boere? Which Boere are you speaking about? Because I see your claim there, and I raise you this man, Bram Fischer, who spent his life in prison against apartheid and did want unity. Now, we recognize that those that don't want to take part in don't want to, and I want to assure you, and I will keep driving this point home in a minute. But yeah, I'm just giving you an example. We have lived amongst many Bram Fischers. We live amongst them in Joburg, like you claimed. Later on in the video that we just watched, and many of them are big fighters for equality. So please speak about yourself, because we know who we live with, and we're not forcing it on you. I will drive the point home more in a minute. All right, so let's just carry on with what he's saying. I will keep driving this point home.
What I'm saying is, then how do we live in one country?
Oh, that's very easy, okay? We can live in this country happily if we have proper borders. So if the Boers have their land, and the Tswanas have their land, and the Zulus have their land, we do not want to mix. Leave Joburg for the cosmopolitans and all this type like.
Okay, so the assumption there is that it's only Joburg who wants unity. So we still vastly outnumber you. But still, I assure you, we are happy that people, for example, in Oranje, and they're happy there and we're not bothering each other. I'm using Oranje as an example. The country is vast, and it is sparsely populated compared to other countries of its size. So those who want to live in those silos, you can. You can live there. You can. It feels like my thoughts are a little bit scattered. As I said, this was an unplanned video. But I agree with the last words that she's saying there, and then listen to Sunette or Sunay.
An important category and an important conversation. There are moments when we have to be honest enough to check ourselves and then to transcend a racial conversation for a bigger conversation that is about class. Yeah.
The reality of South Africa is what happened in the studio. The coloured community is also a minority group, and their rights are being ignored, and even in the Cape.
So here's my thing. This is what I'm talking about. It's very similar to what this gentleman did here. Okay? You weaponized the Indian culture. She weaponized the colored culture. What this tells me about you guys is that there are two things. You guys do recognize the breadth and depth of our history, but if you're only going to weaponize it when it's time to divide us, kindly desist. Kindly desist. Okay? Don't use me as a colored person against black people. Don't use an Indian person against me. Kindly. Okay? Kindly. And why is that? You see, sir, in order to protect your narrative, and your main thing was please don't come for white people, whatever the case is, and you attribute what's happening with black and colored people only to a lack of hard work. You who walk past townships, you drive past townships, we do the walking, right? And you who gets up in the morning and has the opportunity to shower and warm water just comes out, are discounting that just the getting up involved for a black woman taking water that her son had to go and fetch somewhere far yesterday, lighting a primus stove, boiling it, before she could wash her children with 1 bar of sunlight soap. The same children she, who may not have had an education, is going to turn into presidents, which they've done. Nobel Peace Prize winners, which they've done. Rugby World Cup champions, which they've done in ways that people haven't. Miss Universes. But I will talk later about how I don't just want to talk about the greatness that black people do, because they don't have to achieve all these global things in order to be worthy. There are small ways every day that black people in this country are greater than anyone gives them credit for. But I do want to revert to the reality. Just give me a second. Give me some patience. There is plenty. My mind's working faster than my mouth can. Yes, this is the kind of reality that you're ignoring. Please watch.
I mean, if you like racism, inequality, go university. I mean, if it's about 1,200 rand or 2,000 rand, which means I own a Korean as university, even I engage or I netaba in order to teach civilization. If you
yes, and so how can you expect people on 2,000 rand a month? How can we expect people on 2,000 rand a month who do work hard? Okay, the next time you go to Pick and Pay, since we're noticing race, notice the race of all of the cashiers, the cleaners, the security guards. Do Pick and Pays work? Do Checkers works? Do Checkers' work? Do Spas work? Notice and take note of the cashiers. Take note of the foundation. Security guards, cleaners, etc. Do we discount the hard work there? Is that a fair assumption? But on 2,000 rand, how is someone meant to, it's $50. How are they meant to pull themselves out of poverty? Is that the only variable here, sir?
zonke zise-university anikwazi ungena naselibrary.
No, library abadumeli batho ba tsena ka library especially as ba sebetsa or as outsource. But previously ga ba sa dumeli even batho ba ya go toilet ba batla batho ba sebetsa toilet A1. Racism is tsamaishana le inequality.
I'm listening to everything that's been going on, and everyone is talking like us, like.
Do not mistake us for the ones who don't acknowledge stuff such as.
And my brother over here get upset because the reality is there has been an increase of some black people's power. There has been a new black elite that has formed.
So should we?
And so, yes, as I've shown on this channel before, many schools are integrated. Do not divorce that. Previously white spaces are now completely integrated here in Joburg, to my knowledge, right? From what I've seen, and I've seen plenty. I've been an area manager in Joburg, for goodness sake, all the way from Alberton to Pretoria. And I've seen much integration. But don't mistake the fact that, 50 to sometimes 100% of a previously white space is now black or colored or Indian, you know what I mean? Or, it's balanced. That we cannot discount the Alexes and the Sowetos and the Tembisas and the Khayelichas from that. It is still a disproportionate amount of black people in a certain space. And it's not due to the fact that they're not hardworking, okay? Do not mistake us there. Once again, acknowledging myself, who has a relative amounts of privilege, and actually was born into relative amounts of privilege. Relative. It's complex. Compared to the average colored person or whatever. Lebo says the same thing about herself as a black woman.
Educated middle-class woman, I know that when I walk in.
You agree?
I agree very much with what she's saying. I think it's about owning the truth of your own story with all of its complexity. So for me, as an educated middle-class woman, I know that when I walk into spaces, I carry a certain currency that is not carried by my brother who can't pee in a toilet that I peed in when I went to Vits.
Exactly. Exactly.
But at the same time, I also acknowledge that when I do walk into spaces, for example, going into very poor, disenfranchised communities, I also have to acknowledge that the dysfunction that I see that exists in those communities is part of my historical baggage. I carry it within me. It's in my family. It's in my heart. It's in my choices. And what is worrisome is seeing people
that's my thing, is that you are speaking generally thematically here. You're speaking about accountability, and you're acting, though, implying that we don't take accountability, when by taking our own narrative, when I was speaking to a black and colored audience, to which you were invited as a listener, your first concern was, oh, but please don't hurt the feelings of white people. Sir, with all due respect, that is a cheapening of what we are saying. Please desist. I ask you very kindly, we're going to break down what Lebo said again. We acknowledge that there are those amongst us in the black and colored community that have moved forward.
Communities. I also have to acknowledge that the dysfunction that I see that exists in those communities is part of my historical.
Absolutely, part of our historical background. I know you said blackground, fine, blackground. Maybe that was a good Freudian slip. When I go back, Ekasi, when I go back to the township of Innerdale, although I never thought about it as a township until someone told me that it was that. I felt very happy living there for half of my life. I lived between Hillbrow and Innerdale because my dad was allowed to own property in Hillbrow, which position-wise, the positionality that gave me was extraordinary at the time in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. Privilege and proximity to opportunities that were not afforded to my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my literal flesh and blood back home. And we carry that with us. Often we are still sending groceries back there.
Baggage. I carry it within me. It's in my family. It's in my heart. It's in my choices.
And we who are graciously able to navigate the previously white spaces and are very literate in this code switching, have had to navigate that since grade 1. We were aware before we had the vocabulary for this, even in going to school, that if we failed, if we did this, if we did that, that is how our entire race group would be seen. Someone as nondescript as me felt that I was carrying Indian people and colored people and black people when I desegregated my class at the age of 10. In spite of the fact that I looked very much like the white kids in the class. Okay? Breaking down more of what she said.
As an educated middle class woman, I know that when I walk into
You
space,
spoke of education, sir. You spoke of education over here. Those of us who've had it, those of us who've had education, have achieved the same or similar results. Depending on time, I may speak to the challenges you've spoken about having. I'll see how much time I have in this video, or I shall address it in another. Okay?
spaces, I carry a certain currency that is not carried by my brother who can't pee in a toilet that I peed in when I went to Vets.
Exactly.
You know?
We cannot ignore the fact that someone who looks like us or looks similar to our uncle and auntie, which is everyone for me, is still living an apartheid reality. Can't pee in the same toilet as me. Human dignity, sir. We can't shy away from that, sir. And the thing is, there are millions of white people who bravely have very high class situations and perspectives on this and can speak about this with dexterity. In the same way that Boer over there said, us the Boer, and he spoke about you guys as if you're a monolith. We live and exist within spaces where many Boer. I teach Boer young kids, and they are able to speak about this with so much insight, more than people of any color around the world, because they are South African kids first and foremost. And so every time you say stuff like that, you're not doing the Buddha, for example, any favors, because there's enough of a stigma of them around the world. And that was on camera, that you spoke only of one certain kind of Buddha. And it creates this tension because the kind of Buddha that doesn't exist in that space often divorces himself from Afrikanerness in a bigger way. You know, like sometimes I'd like to play Afrikaans music because many of us who aren't white love Afrikaner music. And they're going, no, don't play that. We don't want to make it too Afrikaans. They've learned to reject a part of themselves. And that's not what we're asking anybody to do. Integrate it. The history happened. We're healing it. You know? It's not about pretending that something didn't happen. It's not about just toughening up and not having self-compassion. Those have never been a good way. Toxic positivity is not the way to overcome something. If you have had an amputation, you don't pretend that you haven't had an amputation and just get on with it. You change the environment to suit the fact. But yes, we know, we as the wealthier or comparatively wealthier colored people and black people are still paying a certain tax, right? And even Dan Corder would agree with that.
Ordinary government economic aid. And here's when old people say, oh no, but what about this black person who's wealthy or this black person who's made a lot of money? But here's the thing, right? Bad systems always hide behind miracle cases, the radical exceptions that make it out of a bad system even though it doesn't support them at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let us say that slowly again for the people in the back, because people ain't getting it. You're going to join. When you hear it, Nuance Nikki, you're joining sophisticated conversation about such.
Right? Bad systems always hide behind miracle cases, the radical exceptions that make it out of a bad system even though it doesn't support them at all. They try to make it look like the exception, the miracle, is the average person in the system. And everybody who doesn't make it, well, that's their fault. It's not the system's fault.
No, sir. No, sir. And I've heard people will say something like, what, so you feel sorry for yourself? Self-pity is not the same as self-compassion. Can we have a nuanced conversation? Mitigating circumstances are mitigating circumstances. They are parts of the equation. To ignore them demonizes incredibly hardworking people who happen to be the foundation of what the rest of us have achieved. And we owe it to them to acknowledge that too and not just take full credit. Moving back to the Elizabethan chain of being, part of European thought. it is to be acknowledged that certain certain people in the white community were brought here. If you go to white spaces, I've shown on this video how I went to Alabama and saw extremely poor white people who in their carriage and hulle houding were no different from black people here. They carried the exhaustion of poverty, and I've shown that before. I don't know how to show you a feeling on camera, so you're just going to have to trust me as a traveler, okay? But I found a source on the internet. I forgot, but I damn well created it a few years ago. This is about the Elizabethan chain of being. Let us consider how European thought in the Middle Ages, around the time that people were coming to South Africa, thought about everything in the world and how it was constructed. Not all of this will be foreign to you, but it was much more refined in Shakespeare's time. This is from my other channel, Nikki's Learning Lounge. That channel is more appropriate for kids, and it is part of how I educate kids and help them with their homework. But I reiterate that white people had a vetting system, which is why there's a generational cycle of a certain amount of excellence here. Do you see that I acknowledge the excellence here of our white people? I didn't shy away from it. And being schooled in those spaces has afforded the likes of myself and Lebo and others to navigate that system and navigate that world, not because we are superior to our brothers and sisters in the townships, but because we've been given the tools. And what makes us a driving force, sir, is the fact that we are literate in the ways of coloredness, the ways of blackness, the ways of poverty, and literate in the ways of wealth. We can hold our own. We can hold our own at Bree Street taxi rank, at MTN's taxi rank, in the same way as we can hold our own in the Santon boardroom. Can you say that of yourself, Mr. Discarder of our accomplishments? Please watch my video on the Elizabethan chain of being, which informs a lot of, it's never taught like this, but it does inform a lot of what would happen later. Off European shores, on European shores, a lot of the injustices that happened were not permitted. It was, they sent those people away. They sent those people away. Didn't want them, bro. They didn't want them. Okay? The story of our first enslaved, Abraham van Batavia, I believe, was an Arak driver. He was a stowaway trying to get to the Netherlands, specifically because Netherlands, had he landed on those shores, slavery would not have been allowed. Unfortunately for him, he was caught and ended up on the shores of Cape Town. As such, a generation of slavery then started in our country. But let's go back to Europe. Let's look at this. Please be patient with me here. I was much newer at YouTube, so you do see me stumble a lot. But do wrap your head around this context too, as it informs everything.
The thing with the chain of being is that the Elizabethans really believed that life had a very important structure. Let's see if I can draw a triangle like this, kind of like a pyramid, right? Life had a very, very important structure, right? And if you messed with that structure, you were messing with the order of the universe. You weren't just insulting God. You were, whoopsie-daisies, you were insulting the queen. You were going against nature. You basically were creating chaos, okay? So let's see, over here on top, you've got the order of heaven. Whoops, daisies. Let's see if we can get the order of heaven. Right? So you had God at the center of that, and you had his angels and principalities and all the rest of it, right? Then underneath that, whoops, daisies, you had the order of man. And with the order of man, you had the king and all of his subjects, right? So right below that, coming up third, you have the order of non-living things, things like rocks and the earth and things like that. Okay. So you've got all of those things. Okay, non-living things. Fantastic. And then right at the bottom, you had the order of hell, right? With the devils and the demons and all of those things, right? I think most of us are familiar with this little structure over here. We've all understood it. We've all seen this kind of thing, but it actually became a lot more complicated than that in Shakespeare's day. Right, so let's see if we can get more into it. Now, you don't have to know this in great detail, but it is important to understand. So, as I said, at the very top, you had God, and he had his order of angels, and this became very, 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 very specific, right? Each angel had their own place on the hierarchy, and there were many different kinds of angels, and the Elizabethans were very familiar with all these different kinds of angels. They may actually come up. So I've got this from Pinterest over here. We can just have a look at that. So you have seraphim. Let's just see if we can make it bigger just so we can look into it. You've got the seraphim. This means that they were the burning ones, right? The attendants at the throne of gods. They were right on top. So they praise God and they sing holy, 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 right? Then you have the cherubim. That was the next sort of angels, right? And their name means the fullness of wisdom, right? Then you've got the throne. So that was the first triad. Can you see over here it says first triad? These were the guys that were on top. So you have the thrones, right? And then in the second triad over here, you've got your dominions, your virtues, and your powers. The last triad over there, you've got your principalities, your archangels, and your angels. So each one of them had their own special and very specific place there on the Elizabethan chain of being. Right. So then, hold on. Let's just make that go away, silly image. There we go. I win. Right. So then, after that, you have God who has his parallel on earth. And the parallel on earth is known as the king, of course, right? The king is God's representative on earth. This is very important because if you don't understand this, you won't quite understand why certain things happen, why the weather goes crazy, why there are earthquakes and fires in all of our Shakespeare plays. Now, let's see if I can find you some information on the order of man. Now, at the top, it makes sense that we would have the ruling monarch, right? That will be the king or queen. So let me just write that down for you guys. The ruling monarch, right? So if you don't know what that word means, it just means king or queen. They're on the very top. They are God's representatives on earth. Right after our monarch, in the exact correct order, we've got our nobles, right? And so nobles basically were related to the king. Maybe the king had children with other women outside of his marriage and they didn't want to know that, but he gave them land so they could at least be rich, even if they're not going to be kings or queens. Or maybe they're just cousins and brothers and such things as the king. So your dukes and your earls and the rest of them, right? Now, right under your nobles, you would have your gentry. Your gentry are not quite like your king or your queen. These are people that you normally today see as knights and, so let's see, gentry, knights, dames, those sorts of things. And let me see if I can just move all of these guys up so that I can make more space for the order of man, right? Under your gentry, you have the yeomanry. Can you say that word, yeomanry? Quite an interesting word. That's the middle class people. Okay, they don't really have fancy titles. They've still got to work for their keep. Okay, so these guys, of course, monarchs, the king and queen, they're in charge. Nobles are things like dukes, earls, thanes. Some of those titles some of you don't, some of them you don't know. But basically, they were related to the king or the queen, and with enough deaths, maybe they could become king or queen. That is the theme in one of the plays. The next, you have your gentry, the lords and ladies. So when we say ladies and gentlemen, that's a reference to the gentry, that's knights. Then you have the yeomanry, right? And right underneath that, you have your churls, or the word that we know today as peasantry. Okay? That's why they had to work, peasants had to work outside, the poor. Okay? And if they didn't work, they could be put to death. So that wasn't really very cool, right? So, as you can kind of see, the order of man is a reflection of the order of God. Now, like I said earlier, you had God on top. Then you had your angels underneath him. After the angels, you had the king. After the king, you had all of these lovely people over there. After that, you had non-living things. And at the very bottom, you had the order of hell. Now, we're not going to go into the order of hell in great detail. Basically, the order of hell was kind of like an inside out of the order of heaven. So hell was made up of fallen angels. So you could have fallen cherubim. You could have fallen archangels and all that kind of thing. And they would be at the bottom. Now, what does any of this crazy information have to do with anything? Well, the Elizabethans believed that if you took this and you turned it upside down, all hell would break loose. So, for example, in Macbeth.
Right. So I hope that was insightful to you. So these people had a very specific way of thinking about the world and about class and about, to the point where, there was even an order of flowers with the rose being the king of flowers. Animals with the lion being the king of animals. Everything in its place and a place for everything. That was their understanding of the world, right? They were also living in shifting times, much like our own. It was during the Renaissance. Okay? Then they are confronted with new cultures. Where do they fit in their conceptual scheme, these cultures? They relegate them to the position of savages. Even those who have an incredible amount of autonomy, those who have centuries of wisdom, those who are blue-blooded. And what I'd like to end this off with, since you have given us the theme of the inferiority, the innate inferiority of black and colored people, descendants of all of these people, many of whom were regal. Okay, just give me a second. You see, sir, your narrative about my ancestors and myself is that we are these lazy, sort of self-pitying victims. I'm taking back my narrative. Here is the truth of the kind of person we are. We come from all over the eastern seaboard, all over the Indian Ocean, and there are millions of untold stories like this. But we lost our names, we lost our stories, we lost our languages. But you know what? My grandfather taught me, judge not a man by the heights he hath attained, but by the depths from whence he came. So, watch this.
My name is Masavana. I was asked by the king of Tulia to visit the Dutch ship. We went to view the ship. I was dressed in clean clothes with gold and silver ornaments.
Sorry, I just...
When this was done...
I have a fast brain. I have one side of my brain's overdeveloped. I will play it for you again. My ancestor, Masavana.
But also, he gives details about how he came to be sold as a slave.
My name is Masavana. I was asked by the king of Tulia to visit the Dutch ship. We went to view the ship. I was dressed in clean clothes with gold and silver ornaments. When this was done, halfway back the king tied me up, and his people undressed me.
Okay, so let's start there. You, sir, may look at an image like this of a man dressed in the clothing of his natural people, living in harmony with nature, as perhaps a savage or something similar. As a daughter of many nations, it is important that you see how I see my people. You see, sir, as their daughter, I see them as no different from my other ancestors. And if you have any Buddha blood, our shared ancestors, or even English blood, our shared ancestors, the Germanics, who also lived in nature, also wore the clothes. They all had their thatched homes. They all, right? A man like that was seen in much the way as many of you look at my African ancestors. That is, they were seen as barbarians. In fact, my father taught me this. My Greek father. You ever see my big fat Greek wedding? And they are saying, everything is come from the Greeks. He is telling me, our people, they are looking at people like this. They hear them speak bar, and they call them barbarians. I see people like that as no different from people like this, our shared ancestors, if you are of Germanic descent, who lived in nature. They lived in nature. Sir, I see in what happened to Masavana here.
Halfway back, the king tied me up, and his people undressed me. They took my gold, silver, and clothes off my body. and they sold me as a slave.
This is not a man who was innately a slave. He was made into one. Okay? In the same way that the generations, I will make the point about how that affects your perspective of us in just a moment. They wanted him to be a carefully engineered society. So I see it as no different from this. A king's son, innately a king's son, who was taken away by the Romans and made into what they wanted him to be. That is not his truth. In the same way that the oppression of the people today, which has its foundation, only 30 years of freedom, sir. The oldest born frees in this country are only 30 now, just the class of 2012. Masavana was not a weak man, sir, but rather a man that even took over the slave ship.
And also his belly. He fell down dead immediately. Several sailors fled into the main top. 3 of them were thrown overboard.
Then they started running to the cabin.
These men were not here because of their weakness. They did everything they could. It was time and chance that caused them to become what was made of them. Mitigating circumstances are mitigating circumstances, and they are relevant in spite of what your narratives would like to say about them. Okay, sir? You see, sir, you cannot deny that I have demonstrated that it is not innate whiteness that makes people bad or makes them colonizers. In fact, by the definitions of some white supremacist Greeks and Romans, aren't white. Another thing that I'd love to make a video about one day. However, sir, you'd probably argue that, yes, these people had the same circumstances, but they've built themselves up. I hear your point, and I raise you that they haven't had only 12 years of adulthood. They've also had centuries to do that, and they went through similar processes as what South Africa's gone through. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It wasn't like it happened overnight, sir. It wasn't like it happened overnight, okay? And so, Masavana, what would you like to say, my ancestor, to these people? Speak, Father.
Island. What I think is particularly moving is that he signs right at the end here, there. He signs with his mark, his cross. He makes the sign of the cross. This is the one mark in this huge archive which Masavana himself left directly on the page.
Masavana's story doesn't end here. Nigel Worden has discovered one more document in the vast VOC archive.
So these are the registers of the people who were sent to Robben Island. And as you can see, this is in 1766, so just after his trial. Masavana from Madagascar, sentenced at the Cape on the 25th of August. And there he is. It says, you see here the people who'd arrived. And there's Masavana, together with Corset, the 2 of them. What to me is the moving part. It gives the details of everybody else of how long they've been sentenced for on the island. 5 years, 15 years. But for Masavana and Corset, it says, put on the island until further instructions. So they're dumped there at the mercy of the court to decide how long they're going to stay there. There's no termination to this.
In our country, if somebody kills a person, the king will find the murderer. I am an imprisoned man and only a slave. And you can do with me what you want.
For centuries, Robben Island was used to imprison troublesome rebel leaders, including its most famous resident, Nelson Mandela. Masavana.
You see, sir, I left it up until that point so that you could acknowledge now that this has had an impact until your generation. At this time, while this was happening to colored people, the majority of black people, particularly where I live, were still free and self-sufficient. The likes of Cecil John Rhodes could not get them down. They were incredibly self-sufficient and actually depended on them for many things. Okay? We are not innately deficient. While it is important, Madiba himself that is on this island, he did say that it is not just your circumstances, it's what you make of them. But what I agree with him, but it's also to be acknowledged that what Masavana's story is proven, and the fact that you've most likely never heard of Masavana, is that some circumstances are unscalable. Life is messy. What was he meant to do on that island? A man of dignity, a man of wealth, a man of determination, and a warrior. Okay, I will leave you lastly with this story, okay? But when last did you show up to a gunfight with knives and win, sir? Because here is Sekukune, King Sekukune of the Bapedi people, okay? He won 3 attempts of the Bura to try and invade him. He won 3 attempts, and this is grade 9 history of the British who tried to invade his country. How many wars have you won? It was during the 7th that he fell against people with guns.
Failed 3 times, and after that the British tried to take over the Pedi King.
Sorry, let me just move my face away from the king's face. There we go, so that you can focus on him instead. Moving swiftly forward.
Kingdom, and fought 3 battles against them. 3 times they failed, and the 4th time only they succeeded with the help of 10,000 Swazis as allies. After this battle, Sekukune was jailed in Pretoria. This marked the end of the Bapedi kingdom, or their independence rather. A couple of years.
Note here, many people fetishize the idea of being an African king. What I have demonstrated to you here, sir, is from Pretoria to the Cape, ancestors of black and colored people who are determined, who are warriors, who are not victims, but who are put into impossible circumstances. You try and overcome that. But you know what? Even the people who colonized Sekukune's land did not stoop so low as to dismiss him. Listen now to the words that London and the Buddha said about him, all the way from London.
Defeated kingdom. He was then murdered by his half-brother who claimed to be the lawful king of the kingdom. I would like to share what the London Times wrote in response to his murder.
By the way, how many half-brothers have you been murdered by since we're supposed to do the impossible?
Wrote in response to his murder. We hear this morning from Durban of the death of one of the bravest of our former enemies, the chief Sekukune. The news carries us back to the time when the name Sekukune was the name of dread, first to the Dutch and then to the English colonialists of Transvaal and Natal.
Right, and so the English colonialists of Transvaal and Natal, 2 different countries at the time, saw him with deep respect. They said one of the bravest of our former enemies, sir. As I told you before when you said that there were no places of equality and justice, there are plenty spaces here and in other countries inhabited by black and colored people.
That's what's always fascinated me with Krotoa's story, the little bit that you can read between the texts of people trying to understand something that is fundamentally very strange to them.
It was fundamentally very strange to them was a lot of these notions of dominance, much like it was to the Germanics that I showed earlier. They had no such thing as rape. They had no such thing as slavery. They had
Confronting abuse that she just simply hasn't known. The Khoisan did not have jails. The Khoisan did not have prisons. The Khoisan did not practice slavery. And boom, here are all these 3 things at once.
And sir, to this day there exist some such spaces. To this day there exist such spaces which are being violated. At the bottom you may say that it's people from their own country or similar. However, at the top of the food chain are people from the most powerful countries in the world pulling the strings. This is Congo. Sorry, just give me a second. I'm not sure if my face happens to be in front of what the lady from the City of Joy is saying. Okay, I do wish, since you don't speak French, and by the way, moi je parle français un petit peu. Let's actually hear what she has to say for herself. I'm going back. Please stay with me.
Najua vita. Sa tulianjaka sikia viola, tukukuwa najua viola njo nini.
The powerful countries of the world are funding militias.
So that's what's going on. When they first heard of the word rape, they didn't even know what it was. They had no experience with war. They had never even experienced it. The doctor who reiterates this in this Netflix documentary, he then goes on to speak about how theirs was a world of poetry, how they used to go to the beautiful forests of Congo. Today he works on an average of 10 rapes a day. In spite of that, he can work 17-hour shifts. In spite of that, Dr. Mukwege is the leading gynecologist. Actually, not in spite of that, but because of that. He is the leading OBGYN in the world. He has won a Nobel Peace Prize while you are sitting there in your lofty tower feeling superior to those of us who are descendant of this. Of black people, of colored people, of the ones that you so quickly dismiss as being alcoholics. And
Abondamment et a été immédiatement amené en salle d'opération. Quand je suis arrivé, les infirmières, toutes en larmes, la vessie du nourrisson, son appareil génital, son rectum étaient gravement endommagés par la pénétration d'un adulte. Nous prions en silence. Mon Dieu, dites-nous que ce que nous voyons n'est pas vrai. Dites-nous que c'est un mauvais rêve. Dites-nous qu'au réveil, tout ira bien. Mais ce n'était pas un mauvais rêve. C'était la réalité. C'est devenu notre nouvelle réalité en République démocratique du Congo. Quand un autre bébé est arrivé, j'ai réalisé que ces problèmes ne pouvaient pas trouver une solution au bloc opératoire, mais qu'il fallait...
Sir, this is the foundation of why I have a computer today, why you have a cell phone today, while you have a microphone today, while I have a microphone today, and a mouse. This is what's happening to Congo as it has happened to black and colored people for centuries. The legacy continues here in South Africa. Although in lesser ways, this is what our ancestors have overcome, and similar. Okay? So all these difficulties of which you speak here later, all of the exclusion, I see your sense of superiority and your sense of victimhood, talking about your circumstance. I am white, yet I have inherited nothing from my parents. I was brought up relatively poor area, but poor, not affluent. Due to progressive politics, my father was fired from his job over 30 years ago and told he was white, and that's why he was being fired. He was replaced by an underqualified black man. At that point in time, my father had to choose between bread and milk and could not afford both. I strive for something more for life and say that due to working smart and hard, I am now living affluently. Sir, I have had similar circumstances myself. But I assure you that if you were to compete with me, I wonder if you could say that you achieved the same job you wanted since you were 4 years old, which was acting. I acted for years. I still do it part-time. Sir, can you say that you have made people around the world pay so that you can travel to different countries? Sir, can you say that you started a scholarship for yourself because you weren't afforded one and still didn't make it to a long time at that university? Can you say such, since we are competing? I didn't want to have to do that. Okay? But there have also been stumbling blocks I haven't been able to overcome, and I assure you there have been those in your life. Your notion that you are superior in your work ethic to others who come from different depths is patently false and it's obscene. And stop that. Stop it. I will see if there was anything else I wanted to add. We are over an hour now, and that's not what I intended to do. I hadn't even intended to do this video. I was still just planning it in my head. But it's interesting that my frame of reference means that I could do this without any planning, right? And your frame of reference reduces people with whom you have lived every single day of your life, about whom you have missed right in front of your eyes the greatness of who they are, dismiss them as alcoholics, as was done to Krotoa, dismiss them as druggies, as though colored and black people hold the monopoly on that. The word snow bunny is a word for white girls who do cocaine. Okay, the sense of moral superiority is something I would challenge you to look at, and people of your kin and your ilk. And so I wanted to say that every single day you live amongst amazing black people who in big ways and in small ways do very great things. Very, very great things. Things that you probably miss every single day. Here is a man raised by black woman, a man who this year are reigning, is a doctor, and he happens to be, I think he was also raised by an illiterate woman, to be honest, and he happens to be our reigning Mr. Supernatural, Mr. South Africa at the moment. But before he knew he would win, when another person from another country won, the next, he's the champion, but you see what he did there. That guy's sash fell, and he helped him pick it up. Do you notice things like this, sir? Do you? Or do you only notice... Oh, damn it. Okay, here is South Africa's reigning Mr. Supernatural right now, Dr. Fezile Tanda Mkhize. A small moment where when another man's sash fell in the pageant that he was partaking, he stepped up to him and he fixed his sash. Small moments of greatness that you miss when you dismiss colored and black people as deficient alcoholics, as was done to Krotoa. So, and you came for me because it's not blaming white people, blah, 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 blah. When you actually notice the discourse of black people, for instance, do you notice little moments like this, or do you only nitpick what you consider to be negative?
Is in the country, but its constituency, it's usually Abelungu.
Yes.
And we've heard clips of Ukoko Helen Zille saying...
Did you catch that? Just, it's a slight moment, but if you're not culturally literate, if you're not listening, you don't catch moments like this. How did he refer to a patronizing woman such as Helen Zille?
Yes.
And we've heard clips of Ukoko Helen Zille.
Ukoko Helen Zille. Gogo is the biggest, he can't even help it. It's the biggest, most respectful word in the mind of a black person. Gogo is the queen of a family. And even somebody as patronizing as Helen Zille, he called Ugogo. Right? And so when someone like Prince Mashile is talking over here about South African history, and when he is extremely fair to white people in this rhetoric, are you able to hear that?
Massive in history. So that's 1910, and we can get into detail about it, what it means. Secondly, it brings 1994, because 1994 was different from 19...
He is incredibly articulate here, and he's incredibly fair. Do you hear those moments? Are you able to hear us when we say white people? We don't necessarily mean all white people, but it is our responsibility. It is our responsibility to take back our narrative. It is our responsibility to talk about these things. And yes, we have the right to misspeak, but we do deconstruct. If your uncle has been your abuser, you have a right to speak about him as abuser. It doesn't mean you meant every uncle. Okay? But to be silenced by the other uncle doesn't make the situation right. This has been Nuance with Nikki, and then it's gritty, even if it's shitty, if you're still here at 1 hour, 10 minutes. I want to thank you. I cannot believe I was able to do that video without planning. I had been planning it in my head, but look at how it just rolled off my tongue. May that teach those with the stupid kind of thinking that maybe you need to see what's right in front of you. One last thing, the kind of rhetoric around colored and black people just being alcoholics, the kind that ignores that even Germans and even centuries after they've gone through this, even people like the Irish still have that wound, but we're expected to just heal in 5 minutes. That kind of rhetoric has its roots in 400 years of bullshit, which needs to end right now. It needs to end, and I will show you where, in which place this rhetoric around colored people is rooted. The first, okay, here's another thing, dismissing the contributions of colored and Sotho people to Afrikaans.
Puong ena ya se Africa ke makaru jwalo ka mantswenyana hoi kore yona puo ena ya barwa ha ebe nka kgetha mantswenyana ana ke a nke mona bukeng ena ya Castency jwalo ka mantswe a tshwanang le bo aba aitsa bugu karu khamka kharipu eina khoga jwalo ke mantswe a ebang a nkuwe puong ena ya barwa.
I made that point because of the fact that people continuously, like you have done, dismiss the contributions of black and colored people. But I would remind you that this girl, Kratoa, when after she was abused and notably, after she was abused and normally she was in circumstances most of us can't handle, and she went into alcoholism, sure. Okay, she was supposed to be an example of a baptized, these bastards, these colored bastards, these Grieke bastards as we were called, bastards. Okay, she was supposed to be the example of, the civilized savage, but then they used her instead as the example of how all of us were perceived as alcoholics, in spite of the fact that we don't all drink and such, and those who do are no different from those around the world who did. Okay, so here is what they said at her funeral. After all of that, after all of being a diplomat, in a time long before there was internet or training on being a diplomat, training on speaking multiple languages, she was basically a pioneer of such from the time that she was 10. After all of that, all that were highlighted were her perceived flaws. And this is how they spoke about her when she was laid to rest.
Kratoa is oorlede op 29 Julie 1674 as 'n gevangenes op Robben Eiland. Die omstandighede van haar sterfenis is onduidelik, maar die volgende was haar doodsberig in die amptelike joernaal. This day departed this life, Eva, being thus transferred from this female Hottentot almost into a Netherland woman, married chief surgeon of the residency, by whom she had 3 children. Since his death, however, she had brought forth as many illegitimate ones, and for a long while the desire would have existed for getting rid of her. She had at various times been relegated to Robben Island, but as soon as she returned, she, like the dogs, always returned to her own vomit, so that finally she quenched the fire of her sensuality by death, affording a manifest example that nature, however closely and firmly muzzled by imprinted principles, nevertheless, at its own time triumphing over all precepts, again rushes back to its inborn quality.
Inborn qualities is how you spoke of us, sir. Inborn qualities. She was called Eva, the Eve of colored people. Okay? Almost. She's an almost. That's such rhetoric about mixed race people. They speak about illegitimate children. They do not speak about whether or not she consented to conceiving them when her husband was not there to protect her. She was consistently put onto Robben Island, starting a generational cycle of colored people now being the most incarcerated people in our country. Like the dogs, the word mongrel, sir, comes to mind with which we are referred. Returns to its own vomit. Notions that we are other you know, that we are innately bad and less than. She quenched the fire of her sensuality by death, a global notion of creolized people, that we are sluts and whores, okay? That no matter what we do, we cannot get past this. So I've never done a drug in my life. I was a virgin until the age of 25. And yet I've had the stigma of whore on me so much that the last movie I was cast in, I was cast as a pregnant teenager at the age of 36. Inborn qualities is what you imagine us to have, okay? But here is the truth of the story of someone like Krotoa, and here is the truth of the colored people whom you so equally dismiss.
South Africans, and important that, and who is from the line of Krotoa, who shares that,
or heroine, because she appeals to everybody. She relates to everybody. She is important to everybody, and she is, she is probably the perfect bridge between all cultures of this country.
as a person who is from the line of Krotoa, who shares that ancestral line, it is important for me to know who my ancestors are and to celebrate those ancestors. As South Africans, Krotoa represents a cement. If we liken ourselves to different bricks in our diversity, she is the cement that binds these bricks into the wall we want to call a nation. Krotoa has white descendants. Krotoa has black descendants. Krotoa has descendants who are labeled colored. We have something here in common to explore, to celebrate, to build upon. If we use the cement as a nation, we can be a strong wall. If we remain just bricks piled on top of each other, this nation is going to fall apart.
Sir, when you perceive the colored child in that way, the one who most looks like our shared ancestor Krotoa, the colored child who is the who is the cement of the different bricks of South Africa, the Khoisan, who is our common ancestor, you disrespect your mother and people who represent her. This has been Nuance with Nikki. The nitty gritty, even if it's shitty. I hope you have enjoyed that one. God bless Krotoa. Thank you, Mama. Thank you.